Is this some kind of joke? The voice cut through the stale air, sharp with the bite of disdain. John Miller, an old veteran, sat quietly behind the wheel of his old food truck, the engine humming softly as the world passed by. He had been sitting there for hours, the sun beating down on his weathered face, his pale blue eyes scanning the street in front of him. No one seemed to notice him. No one seemed to care. The world had moved on, and John had been left behind. He had fought for this country, given his youth and health, and yet here he was, alone in his old age, serving food to those who passed by. He wasn't asking for gratitude. He wasn't asking for recognition. But all he wanted was a little respect. A young man walked by, his eyes scanning the truck, his lips curling into a sneer. "What's this? Some old guy's food stand? Do you even know what you're doing?" The young man laughed with his friends, the sound loud and brash, a stark contrast to John's quiet demeanor. John didn't flinch. He didn't need to. His hands, rough with age and experience, gripped the stirring spoon in the pot before him. He had been through much worse than this. He had seen battlefields, had heard the screams of men in pain, had held dying comrades in his arms. The petty mockery of some young kid didn't matter. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. John had long ago learned the value of silence. The young man and his friends walked off, still laughing, still mocking, oblivious to the man who had stood on foreign soil, fighting for a country they took for granted. But John wasn't just any old man. His memories were sharper than they seemed, his actions weighed heavier than they could ever know. As the crowd drifted by, a familiar face appeared, one that John hadn't seen in years. It was a man, a former soldier, his eyes tired but still filled with the fire of youth. The man approached John's truck, his gaze lingering for a moment before he spoke. "You really doing this?" he asked, a skeptical tone in his voice. John gave a small nod. "It's what I do now," he replied quietly, his hand still moving with the practiced ease of years. "Spent in service." The man looked at him for a moment, then down at the food truck. "I heard about you. You've been feeding people for free, haven't you?" John didn't answer, instead turning to prepare another meal. The man lingered, watching him, until something clicked. "You know, I heard you served with General Wallace. Saved his life, didn't you?" John paused, his hand still. The name Wallace brought back memories of a war that felt both like yesterday and a lifetime ago. Wallace had been a young officer back then, a man with a future. He had been the one John had carried off the battlefield, the one John had saved when no one else could. But Wallace had never come back to thank him. And that was fine. John hadn't expected it. "Yeah, I saved him," John said softly, his voice thick with the weight of time. The man's expression shifted, a mix of surprise and respect crossing his face. "Well, you've got more than food to give, don't you?" he said, stepping back. John looked up, his blue eyes steady. "I've given all I can," he said quietly. "Now I'm just doing what I can to help." The man paused for a moment, then nodded. "Good to see you again, old man," he said, and with that, he walked away. But John felt something shift inside him. He wasn't just an old man anymore. He wasn't just a forgotten veteran. There was still power in what he did, in who he was. As the day went on, more and more people started stopping by the truck. Some came out of curiosity, some because they needed food, and some because they had heard the stories. The food truck became a place of respect, a place where people stopped not just for a meal, but for something more. And for the first time in a long while, John Miller smiled. He had his respect. He had earned it long ago, and now, just maybe, he was starting to get it back. John Miller stood by his food truck, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. The crowd had grown quieter, the usual noise of the street fading as people began to stop in front of him, curious but respectful. The day had gone better than expected, but there was still a sense of hesitation in the air. The man who had spoken to him earlier, Ben Carter, the former soldier, hadn't returned, but something about that conversation stuck with John. It wasn't just the recognition of his past, the acknowledgement that he had been someone once. No, it was the way Carter had looked at him, like he was seeing more than just the old veteran standing behind the counter. John adjusted the straps on his apron and gave a small sigh. He wasn't used to this. Being noticed like this. But maybe it wasn't so bad after all. He ladled soup into another container, handed it to a woman who had been eyeing him from the side. She smiled at him, a soft but genuine expression, before walking away with her meal. "Thank you," she said as she turned, her voice carrying a note of gratitude that felt unfamiliar yet comforting. As the day wore on, more and more people came, not just for the food, but for the quiet company of an old man who had given more than most could ever understand. Each person had their own story, their own reason for stopping, but John found a certain peace in the act of serving them. He didn't need to be a hero. He didn't need to be someone remembered for medals or glory. He was just a man doing what he could to help. The sun was nearly gone now, and the light in the streets had shifted to a warmer, softer glow. The last group of customers for the day approached, a small family with 2 children. The father looked around, his eyes falling on the truck, then back to his family. "You think this is the place?" he asked, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. John smiled and nodded. "Yeah," he replied simply. "It's the place." The family approached the truck, the children shyly looking at the food, then at John. The father cleared his throat, then spoke again. "I heard you were the one who served General Wallace all those years ago. Saved his life." John paused, the name hitting him harder than he expected. He had carried Wallace off the battlefield so many years ago. That was the past, but hearing it now felt like it was yesterday. "Yeah," John said, his voice quiet. "That was me." The father didn't say anything more, but his eyes softened, and he nodded in. "Respect." John served them their food, and they walked away, leaving him standing there, still feeling the weight of the years. He wasn't sure how to explain it to anyone. That sense of being both forgotten and remembered all at once. But for the first time in a long while, it felt right. As the day came to a close, John closed up the truck and looked around. The street was quieter now, but there was a sense of fulfillment that washed over him. He had done something good. Something that mattered. It wasn't about the medals or the glory. It was about making a difference in the lives of those who needed it the most. And for the first time in a long while, John Miller felt like he had finally found his place again. The next morning, John Miller was already at his food truck, a little earlier than usual. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a golden light over the empty street. The hustle and bustle of the city hadn't quite begun, but John had always been an early riser. He liked the quiet. He liked the stillness before the world picked up speed. As he prepared his first batch of food for the day, he could hear footsteps approaching. It wasn't long before a familiar face appeared in front of him, Ben Carter, the man who had spoken to him the day before. Ben's expression was different today. There was no skepticism, no doubt in his eyes. Only respect. "Morning," Ben said, his voice steady. "Mind if I help out today?" John looked up, surprised. "Help out," he repeated, wiping his hands on his apron. "You sure about that?" Ben nodded. "Yeah, I've got some time. And, well, I figured you could use an extra set of hands." John smiled, a small but genuine expression. "All right then, grab an apron." Ben did as he was told, stepping behind the counter. It wasn't long before they were working side by side, preparing meals for the people who began trickling by. As the morning went on, more and more people stopped by the truck. Some were regulars, others just curious, but each one left with a meal and a word of thanks. Ben worked diligently, his earlier arrogance replaced with a quiet humility. John couldn't help but notice the change in him. Yesterday, Ben had been skeptical. Even mocking. But today, he was fully engaged, helping to prepare the food with a newfound respect. It was the small things that mattered, how Ben carefully handed the soup to the customers, how he asked questions about the meals, genuinely wanting to know how to make them better. The air was warmer now, the street more lively as the hours passed. John glanced up, watching as a young man walked by, his eye scanning the food truck. He was the same guy who had mocked John yesterday, the one who had called his truck a joke. John watched the young man pause, his gaze lingering on the food truck before looking down at his feet. The young man hesitated for a moment, and then, as if unsure of what to do, he walked over to the counter. I was wondering if I could get something to eat, he said, his voice more tentative than it had been the day before. John smiled warmly, offering the man a plate of food. Of course, son. It's on the house, he said. The young man looked up, surprised. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Thanks, he said quietly, before walking away. Ben watched the exchange, his eyes narrowed in thought. You know, that kid's attitude changed pretty quick, he said, half to himself. John chuckled softly, wiping his hands on a towel. Sometimes it takes a little while for people to see things differently. Maybe this is just what he needed. The day passed by in a blur of activity. The food truck was busier than ever, the line of people stretching down the street. John continued to serve with Ben by his side, and for the first time in a long while, John felt a sense of peace. He wasn't alone anymore. He wasn't just the old man behind the food truck. He was someone who mattered. He was making a difference. As the sun began to set and the last customers left, Ben turned to John, a small smile on his face. You know, I think this is one of the best things I've ever done, he said. John nodded, his eyes twinkling with understanding. Yeah, it's a good feeling, isn't it? Ben nodded again, a deeper respect in his eyes than before. You've got something real here, John. You're doing something that really matters. John didn't say anything at first, just watched the street as the last of the light faded from the sky. It's not about the food, he said after a long pause. It's about what we do for each other. That's what matters. Ben stood there for a moment, soaking in the weight of John's words. Then, with a nod, he turned to help close the truck. The day was over, but something had shifted in both of them. Something had changed in the way they saw the world and the people around them. For the first time in years, John felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The following week, John Miller found himself waking up earlier than usual. The morning air was crisp, and the street in front of his food truck was still quiet. There was a new energy in him, a sense of purpose that had been absent for far too long. He adjusted the sleeves of his old jacket, took a deep breath, and began preparing for the day ahead. As he worked, the sound of footsteps echoed down the street. He looked up to see a familiar face, Ben Carter. Ben had been back every day since he started helping at the truck, and his transformation was evident. Gone was the skepticism, replaced by a quiet determination. Morning, John, Ben said, his voice calm but filled with respect. Mind if I help out again today? John smiled, his hands busy with the ingredients in front of him. I was hoping you would, he replied. The day began like any other, but this time, something felt different. More people came by than usual. Some were new faces, others were regulars who had returned. Word had begun to spread about the food truck, about the man behind it, and about what it stood for. As the line grew longer, John noticed a woman standing near the truck, watching from a distance. She was older, maybe in her 50s, with a quiet but strong presence. She waited patiently as others were served, and when her turn came, she stepped forward. Are you John Miller? She asked, her voice tentative. John nodded, wiping his hands on a towel. That's me, he said, eyeing her curiously. How can I help you? The woman smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. I heard about you. I heard. You were the one who saved General Wallace all those years ago. My husband served with him. He was there when Wallace was rescued. John's heart tightened at the mention of Wallace. He had saved that young officer on the battlefield, and hearing the name again stirred a mix of emotions he hadn't expected. Your husband served with him? John asked, his voice softer now. The woman nodded. He passed a few years ago, but he always spoke of that day. He said you were the one who brought him back, the the one who kept him alive when no one else could. He was always grateful to you. John was silent for a moment, the weight of the word settling in his chest. He had never sought recognition for his actions. In fact, he had never spoken much about the past, not even to his family. But hearing it now, from someone who had known Wallace personally, made him feel a sense of validation he hadn't realized he needed. "Thank you," John said quietly, his voice thick. "I did what I could." The woman reached into her purse and pulled out a small, worn photograph. She handed it to him, a photo of a young John Miller and a younger General Wallace, standing together in the heat of a distant battlefield. "This is from my husband's collection," she said. "He always kept it close. I thought you might like to have it." John took the photograph in his hands, his fingers tracing the edges of the image. The memories came rushing back, memories of the men he had fought beside, the lives he had tried to save, and the bond that had formed in the chaos of war. "Thank you," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman smiled, her eyes warm with gratitude. "You don't have to thank me. I just wanted you to know that your story, your sacrifice, it hasn't been forgotten." As she walked away, John stood there for a moment, the photograph clutched in his hands. Ben, who had been observing the exchange from the side, stepped forward. "That was a pretty powerful moment," he said, his voice quiet. John nodded, still lost in the weight of the past. "Yeah," he said softly. "It was." As the day went on, John felt a sense of peace settle over him. The food truck had become more than just a place to get a meal. It had become a symbol, a place where stories were shared, where people were reminded of the sacrifices made, and where a quiet old man could finally receive the recognition he deserved. By the time the sun began to set, the line had faded, and the street had quieted once again. John looked at Ben, who was packing up the last of the supplies. "You know, Ben," John said, his voice filled with a quiet pride, "I think this truck is doing more than just feeding people." Ben looked up, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, I think you're right," he said. "It's about more than just the food." John nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "It's about making sure the people who matter aren't forgotten." Ben stood there for a moment, then nodded in agreement. "You're doing something good here, John. Something real." John Miller looked at the truck, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the pavement. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he had found his place in the world again. And it wasn't about the medals or the recognition. It was about giving something back. Something that truly mattered. As the days passed, John Miller began to see a change in his small corner of the world. The food truck had become more than just a means of survival for those in need, it had become a gathering place, a symbol of something bigger. People began to come not just for the meals, but to share their stories, their memories, their gratitude. It was as if they had finally realized that John was not just some old man serving food, he was a bridge to the past, a link to a time when sacrifices were made without question. One afternoon, a well-dressed man approached the truck. John didn't recognize him at first, but there was something about the man's demeanor that suggested he wasn't just another passerby. "Are you John Miller?" the man asked, his tone respectful but somewhat tentative. John looked up from his work, wiping his hands on his apron. "Yeah, that's me," he said, his voice calm but steady. The man smiled slightly, his eyes flicking over the food truck before landing back on John. "I'm Richard Collins," he said. "I work for a local veterans organization. I've heard about what you're doing here." John didn't say anything immediately. He wasn't sure what this man wanted or why he was here. "What I'm doing?" John finally asked, his curiosity piqued. "Yes," Collins said, his smile widening. "The food, the community, the way you've made this place a home for so many. We want to help you grow. Your work is inspiring." John was silent for a moment, letting the words settle in. He had never thought of what he was doing as anything special. He was just feeding people, doing what he could. But hearing it from someone else, someone who recognized it, made him see things differently. We've been thinking about ways we can support you, Collins continued. We have the resources, the connections, and we want to see this work continue, expand even. John stood still, absorbing the offer. It wasn't about the money, he realized. It was about what the offer represented: respect, acknowledgement, and a chance to make an even bigger difference. I appreciate that, John said, finally breaking the silence. But I'm not in this for anything but the people. I don't need a lot of help, but if you can get more people to know about this, that would be great. Collins nodded, understanding John's hesitation. We can do that. We can help spread the word, get more support from the community, and bring in more resources for you. But you're right, it's about the people, isn't it? John smiled, his eyes softening. Yeah, he said quietly. It's always been about the people. Over the next few weeks, things started to change in ways John hadn't expected. More volunteers came forward to help with the truck. Donations began to pour in, not just money, but supplies, fresh ingredients, cooking equipment, and even a new truck to replace the old one that had served him well but was showing signs of age. The community had rallied behind him, and the sense of support was overwhelming. But it wasn't just the physical changes that stood out. The real transformation was in the way people looked at him. They saw him now for who he was, not just a man running a food truck, but a man who had served his country, who had fought and sacrificed, and who now, in his later years, was still giving back in a way that mattered. One day, as John was closing up for the night, Ben Carter came by as usual. But today, Ben had something new in his hand, a small plaque, engraved with the words, "In recognition of service, compassion, and community." Ben held it out to John with a grin. "I think you've earned this," he said. John took the plaque in his hands, feeling the weight of it, not physically, but emotionally. It wasn't a medal. It wasn't a formal recognition. But it was something that meant more than any of that. It was the acknowledgement that what he was doing mattered. "Thanks, Ben," John said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Ben nodded, his smile softening. "You've earned it," he repeated. John stared at the plaque for a moment, his mind flashing back to the past, the wars, the friends lost, the struggles, the quiet nights in foreign lands. But then, he looked up, back at the truck, and the people who had come to depend on it. And for the first time in years, John felt truly at peace. He didn't need the recognition, but he appreciated it all the same. It was a sign that his work was being seen, and that was enough. As the evening settled in and the last of the customers left, John stood by the truck, a quiet smile on his face. He had found his place again, not through the accolades or the medals, but through the simple act of giving. And in that, he had found something more valuable than anything he had ever earned before. As the weeks turned into months, John Miller's food truck continued to be a constant presence in the community. The truck had become more than just a place to get a meal, it had become a symbol of something greater. A reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could change lives. John had never imagined that something so simple could grow into something so meaningful. One cool autumn morning, as he was preparing his usual batch of soup, Ben Carter walked up to the truck. He had been helping out every day since the organization's involvement, and John had come to rely on his steady presence. "Got a minute, John?" Ben asked, his voice carrying an unusual seriousness. John looked up, his brow furrowing slightly. "Of course, what's on your mind?" Ben took a deep breath, glancing around the street before meeting John's gaze. "There's been some talk. People in the community, well, they've been asking if there's a way to expand what you're doing here. They want to know if we could bring in more food trucks, more volunteers. I think it's time to take this further." John paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. He had always been content with keeping things small, a simple operation where he could serve those in need, but hearing Ben's words made him realize that what had started as a small food truck might actually be the start of something bigger. "Expand?" John repeated slowly. "I don't know, Ben. This was never about expanding. It's just about helping where I can." Ben nodded, understanding John's hesitation. "I get it, John. I really do. But think about it. If we could bring in more people, more resources, we could feed even more families. We could get more people the help they need. John turned to look at the long line of people waiting for food, some of them smiling and talking among themselves, others quietly looking down, lost in thought. He had always done this on his own terms, keeping things simple and within his control. The idea of expanding, of relying on others to manage what he had built, made him uneasy. But as he watched the faces of those he helped, he realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about them. "What are you asking, exactly?" John said finally, his voice thoughtful. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to let me help you grow this," Ben replied. "Not just here in this neighborhood, but in other places too. There's a whole lot of people out there who could use a hand, and I think we could really make a difference if we work together." John thought about it for a moment longer, then nodded. "All right, Ben," he said. "Let's see where this goes. But I want to keep it personal. I don't want this to lose the heart of what it is." Ben smiled, relieved. "I wouldn't let that happen. I promise." The next few days were filled with meetings and phone calls, organizing volunteers and donations, preparing for something bigger than either of them had expected. John wasn't sure about all of it yet, but as he watched the people come and go from the truck, the idea of reaching more people didn't seem so daunting anymore. It was just another way to help. And that was something John had always known how to do. As the truck grew busier, so did the sense of purpose John felt. The work never stopped, but neither did the gratitude that flowed from those who received the food. The neighborhood began to change. People began to talk to each other more, share their own stories, and the sense of community that had once been absent started to take root. It wasn't just about feeding people anymore, it was about bringing people together. By the end of the month, the food truck had turned into something even bigger. They had added another truck to serve in another part of the city, and more volunteers were coming every day. The community had embraced what John had started, and it was no longer just his mission, it had become theirs. But even as it expanded, the core of what John had built remained unchanged. It was about respect. It was about kindness. It was about making sure that no one was forgotten, no matter who they were or where they came from. As John sat behind the counter of his food truck that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky, he realized that he had found something he had been searching for all his life. Not recognition, not glory, but purpose. And in that moment, John Miller felt truly at peace. As the months passed, the food truck continued to grow, its impact spreading beyond the small neighborhood where it all began. The second truck had been a success, serving in a different part of the city, and soon enough, people from neighboring towns began to hear about John Miller's mission. The word spread like wildfire, and the truck became a symbol of hope for many. John never expected this. He had never imagined that his small act of kindness could ripple out and change so many lives. But here he was, at the center of something bigger than himself, yet it still felt like the same humble operation. It still felt personal. One morning, as John was serving his usual breakfast crowd, a woman walked up to the truck. She was in her late 30s, well-dressed, and carried an air of purpose about her. John glanced up, giving her a warm nod. "Morning," he said, his voice steady. The woman smiled briefly, her eye scanning the truck before settling on John. "Are you John Miller?" she asked, her tone calm but direct. John wiped his hands on his apron, noting the seriousness in her voice. "I am. What can I do for you?" The woman hesitated for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. "I'm with the local government," she began, "and we've been following your work for some time now. Your food trucks have become more than just a source of meals. You're building a real community here. I wanted to talk to you about an opportunity to partner with the city." John raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. "Partner with the city?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. "Yes," the woman continued. "We've been looking for ways to expand services for low-income families in underserved areas. Your initiative aligns perfectly with our goals, and we'd like to support your work, provide resources, funding, and possibly even more trucks to reach even more people. John stood silent for a moment, considering her words. He wasn't used to offers like this, not from the city or anyone with such authority. His food truck had always been a personal endeavor, something he did because it felt right, because he wanted to make a difference. I don't know, John said finally, his voice thoughtful. I never planned on getting big. It's just about helping people, not making a business out of it. The woman nodded understandingly. I get it. And I respect that. But think about it. With the resources we can provide, you could help so many more people, people who are struggling and don't have the means to get the help they need. You could continue doing what you love, but on a much larger scale. John's gaze drifted out to the line of people waiting, the faces of those he had come to know, many of whom had become regulars. He had always felt like he was doing enough, that every meal served was making a difference. But now, hearing her words, he realized there was so much more that could be done. I've spent my whole life serving others, John said, his voice quieter now. It's all I know how to do. But I don't want to lose the heart of what I've built. I don't want it to become just another business. The woman smiled, her expression softening. I understand, John. And I promise we won't take away what makes this special. We want to help, not change what you've created. We want to support the heart of this, not take it away. John looked at her for a long moment, weighing his options. He had always been independent, doing things his way. But the thought of helping more people, of reaching even more who needed it, tugged at his heart. All right, he said finally. I'll give it a shot. But we do it my way, on my terms. The woman's face lit up with a smile. Of course, John. I think this could be the start of something great. Over the next few weeks, the city's support began to materialize. The second food truck expanded into a third, and with the added resources, John was able to hire more people to help. But despite the growth, the core of what he had built remained unchanged. The food truck still served those in need, the meals still came from the heart, and John was still there, working alongside his team, talking to the people, listening to their stories. The community that had once felt so small now felt like a family, and John knew, more than ever, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. His mission hadn't changed, it had just grown. And for the first time in his life, John Miller felt like the world was finally starting to see him for who he was, not just an old veteran, but a man who had found a way to make a real difference in the lives of others. Months passed, and John Miller's food trucks continued to thrive, becoming a staple in the city. It was more than just a business now, it had turned into a movement. A movement of kindness, of compassion, of people coming together to help each other. John had seen it all, from the regulars who came for their daily meal to the strangers who walked up in need of a warm meal and a listening ear. And with each passing day, he felt more certain that this was exactly where he was meant to be. One cold winter morning, as the first snow of the season began to fall, John stood at the food truck, preparing for another busy day. The familiar scent of soup simmering on the stove filled the air, and the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow was a welcome sign of the day's beginning. As he handed out meals to the people who had gathered, a young man walked up, carrying a large box. He was in his 20s, wearing a navy blue jacket and a cap that hid his face. He stopped in front of the truck, his hands hesitating for a moment before he spoke. "Are you John Miller?" the young man asked, his voice a little uncertain. John looked up, wiping his hands on his apron. "That's me. How can I help you?" The young man glanced at the box in his hands before holding it out. "I've been working with the local veterans group," he said. "We heard about what you've been doing here, and we wanted to help. This is from us. It's not much, but it's a start." John took the box from him, surprised at the gesture. When he opened it, he found a collection of non-perishable food items, bags of rice, cans of beans, and other supplies that would help keep the food trucks running through the winter months. "This means a lot," John said quietly, his voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you." The young man smiled, his eyes bright with pride. "It's the least we could do." You've done so much for the community. We wanted to give back in some way." John nodded, touched by the gesture. As the young man turned to leave, John called out to him. "Hey, what's your name?" The young man paused, then turned back with a small grin. "It's Chris," he said. "Chris Baker. I'm a Navy veteran. Just wanted to make sure you knew that you've got support." John's heart swelled with appreciation. "Thank you, Chris," he said, his voice strong with sincerity. "That means more than you know." As the young man walked away, John felt a warmth spread through him. It wasn't just the food that mattered, it was the connections, the recognition, and the fact that people were starting to see the true impact of what he was doing. This wasn't just about feeding people. It was about building a network of support, about making sure that no one ever felt forgotten. Over the next few weeks, the community support continued to grow. The trucks expanded further, reaching even more areas, and more volunteers stepped up to help. But for John, it was never about the size of the operation. It was about the faces, the smiles, the grateful nods, the people who walked away with a full stomach and a sense of belonging. On Christmas Eve, as the truck served its last meal of the day, John stood outside, watching the snowflakes fall gently from the sky. Ben Carter, who had been by his side since the beginning, stepped up next to him, his breath visible in the cold air. "I think we've done something good here," Ben said, his voice thoughtful. John nodded, his eyes fixed on the street ahead. "We've done more than good, Ben," he replied. "We've done what needed to be done. And we're just getting started." As the night wore on, the food truck slowly shut down for the evening, the lights dimming as the last of the volunteers packed up for the night. John stood in the quiet, looking around at the space he had created, this small corner of the world that had grown into something larger than himself. It wasn't about recognition or accolades. It was about people. People helping people. And that was enough. John Miller knew, deep down, that this was his legacy. Not the medals, not the glory, but the work he had done, the lives he had touched, and the community he had built from the ground up. And that was a legacy worth leaving behind. The months turned into a full year, and John Miller stood before his food truck, watching the snowflakes gently drift from the sky. It was a quiet evening, the street still, but the warmth inside the truck was comforting. The once small operation had now expanded, reaching further into the city and beyond. More volunteers were helping, and the community had fully embraced the mission. But through it all, John remained the same at his core. He hadn't changed. The food was still served with a smile, the doors were always open, and the gratitude of those he helped was his greatest reward. Ben Carter was there, as always, working beside him, but tonight was different. The truck had reached its peak for the season, and it was time to reflect on how far they had come. "You ever thought about how far we've come?" Ben asked, looking around at the truck. And the small crowd that had gathered. John nodded, his expression soft. "Every day," he replied. "But I never thought it would turn into this. This a movement. It's bigger than I ever imagined." Ben smiled. "You did something special here, John. You gave more than food. You gave hope, you gave people a place to belong. That's something a lot of people never get." John's gaze drifted over the crowd. A young woman who had been coming for meals with her 2 children, a man who was now working with the volunteers after once receiving a meal himself, a group of elderly neighbors who had found a sense of community in their shared meals. They were all here because of him. "I just did what I knew best," John said quietly. "I never wanted anything more than to help. And now, it's not just me. It's all of us, working together." Ben's smile widened. "Yeah, you brought everyone together. You didn't just serve meals, John. You brought dignity, respect, and a sense of family." John paused for a moment, feeling the weight of Ben's words. He had never sought recognition, never looked for applause. But hearing it now, he realized how much more this had become than just feeding the hungry. It had become a symbol of resilience, of people coming together to make a difference. The truck had become a beacon for the community. You know, I've been thinking, John said, turning toward Ben. Maybe it's time to take a step back. I've built something here, but I think it's time for others to take over. Ben's eyes widened slightly. Take over? John nodded slowly. I don't need to be the face of this anymore. This was never about me. It's about the community, the people who have made this possible. I've given all I can. Now it's time for others to carry it forward. Ben looked at John for a long moment before nodding in understanding. You've done something incredible, John. And you're right. It's bigger than any one person. But what you've done here, what you've built, it won't fade. It'll keep going, and it'll keep growing, because you made it real. John smiled faintly. I hope so. As the night wore on, the last of the customers received their meals, and the truck slowly emptied. The lights dimmed, the quiet settling over the street. But for John, it was a peaceful kind of quiet, a quiet that came from knowing that what he had started would continue to thrive, even without him at the helm. It wasn't about the food anymore. It was about the connections, the stories, and the love shared between people who had been brought together by something as simple as a warm meal. John stood at the door of the truck, looking out at the empty street, and for the first time in a long time, he felt content. He had found his purpose, and he had given everything to it. And that was enough.